In just a couple weeks, Judaism Unbound's Fall 2023 courses begin in the Anya Shiva, our digital center for Jewish learning and unlearning. One of the courses we are offering this year is taught by Yoshi Silverstein, a past guest of ours on the podcast in episode 360, entitled Your Body is a Sukkah. So that our listeners can get a full taste of Yoshi Silverstein's wisdom, and because his episode ties to the holiday of Sukkot, which begins in just a few days, we are re-releasing his appearance on the podcast as a bonus episode. The first time around, it was a huge hit, and we hope that those who missed it when it was first released will enjoy it now. If you listen to this episode and you'd like to sign up for Yoshi Silverstein's course in the Anya Shiva, you can do so by heading to www.judaismunbound.com/classes.
This is Judaism Unbound, episode 360. Your body is a sukkah. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dan Liebenson.
And I'm Lex Rofberg.
And we are excited to continue our mini-series on spirituality with today's guest, Yoshi Silverstein, who's the founder and executive director of an organization called Mitsui Collective. Before we jump into that conversation, just a quick note. If you made an end-of-year gift to Judaism Unbound, we thank you for that. And if you didn't have a chance to make an end-of-the-year gift, we would be grateful if you might consider giving a small amount on a monthly basis, which you can sign up to do at our website, judaismunbound.com/donate. If everybody out there who's listening to Judaism Unbound would consider giving a monthly gift of $4 or $5 to represent $1 for every episode we put out each month, that would be an amazing thing for us and for the way to support a nonprofit organization with small gifts, which is really our goal and we think the future way that Judaism has to be supported. So please consider doing that at judaismunbound.com/donate. And while you're on our website, you can also go to judaismunbound.com/classes and you can see that we are starting to populate that page with our newest group of Anya Shiva classes. These are going to be 12-week full semester classes. They are awesome, have some amazing teachers, and also Lex and me. And we think you're going to find some really cool stuff there. We're going to talk about that in more detail in the weeks ahead. So let's jump back into our series on spirituality with Yoshi Silverstein. By the way, thanks so much to everybody who sent us feedback on the beginning of this spirituality series. It seems to be really striking a nerve, and we would love to hear more of your feedback and ideas, so please keep it coming. Our guest today is Yoshi Silverstein. He is the founder and executive director of Mitsui Collective. Mitsui is an Aramaic word that means to bring forth and is interpreted by Mitsui Collective to mean something like to seek out, to extract, to reveal, or to activate our potential. Mitsui Collective's mission, which we're going to get into in detail about what all of this means, is to build resilient community through embodied Jewish practice and somatic anti-racism. It designs and facilitates holistic, whole-body Jewish learning and practice. Its work explores the experience of Jewish life and learning through our bodies and our understanding of how Jewish identities and experiences are impacted because of the bodies we are in. Mitsui Collective augments the spaces and methods through which Judaism prepares, supports, and nourishes both the individual and the collective for greater health, resiliency, and wellness in body and soul. Our guest today, Yoshi Silverstein, describes himself as a Chinese Ashkenazi American Jew and a multidisciplinary practitioner of embodied creative expression, spiritual exploration, and somatic anti-racism. Prior to founding Mitsui Collective, Yoshi Silverstein spent over 2 decades in the outdoor food, farming, and environmental education space, both within the Jewish community and outside it, including serving as founding director of the Jaffe Fellowship at Hazon through its first 4 cohorts. Also relevant to his founding of Mitsui Collective, Yoshi Silverstein has been an assistant coach at his local CrossFit, and he also holds a second-degree black belt in Lotus Kaju Kenbo, as well as a master's degree in landscape architecture and certificates in spiritual entrepreneurship, social entrepreneurship, permaculture design, and environmental education. Yoshi Silverstein has also taught on the faculties of the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College, M² Institute for Experiential Jewish Education, Avodah's Institute for Social Change, and the Institute for Jewish Spirituality. And just this past year, Yoshi Silverstein was awarded the 2022 Pomegranate Prize from the Covenant Foundation, which is an extremely prestigious award for emerging leaders in Jewish education. And so, Yoshi Silverstein, welcome to Judaism Unbound. It's so great to have you.
Thank you. It's an honor and a pleasure. I've been a longtime fan, and I'm excited to be here.
Well, those are always our favorite interviews. So I just introduced Mitsui Collective's mission, and I wanted to get into some of those particular phrases that you use in the mission of Mitsui Collective. Can you first talk a little bit about embodied Jewish practice, what that looks like?
Absolutely. So when we think about embodiment, there's a lot of different layers that we can sort of look at. The most overarching and increasingly compelling layer for me is to think about what are the values that we strive to live by? And then how do we actually embody those values, right? What does it actually look like to be living into those values literally in how we move through the world, right? So when you're looking at someone in how are they behaving? How are they acting, right? How are we talking? Like all of those things, those happen through the body, right? And so when we talk about embodying something, that's this sort of large level of how are we embodying the values we strive to live by? And there's always a gap, right? Like values are kind of by nature idealistic, but the wider the gap is, the less we're embodying those values. And so on some level, our work is trying to shrink that gap. In order to do that, one, we have to identify what are our values. And then we go about the process of now we need to practice embodying those values. So on some level, embodied practice it's kind of like exactly what it sounds like. We're practicing doing the thing, right? And so then we're thinking, okay, these are the ways in which we're creating a practice of something, specific modalities of experience and expression that happen through the body, movement, breath work, song and music, connecting with nature, things that are really happening again through the physical body, through the physical experience, and through our sensory capacities, right? And then that physical experience serves as a sort of gateway or portal for all these other layers that then tend to come up, where we think about then we have this emotional experience, a spiritual experience, an intellectual experience, right? But we encounter the world through our bodies, and then everything else kind of falls into place. So when we're thinking about embodied Jewish practice, we're thinking, okay, what are those practices? And then what are the specifically Jewish versions of them? How is it grounded in Jewish ideas, concepts, frameworks, traditions? A lot more to be said about that, but that's where we get into some of the particular of like, all right, what does this look like specifically Jewishly?
When you first started talking about embodied Jewish practice, I was thinking like, wait, so are you talking about something analogous to what I would call halakha? Like, a lot of people hear the word halakha, if they even know what it means, and they think it means Jewish law. And we've had episodes on this, but I've never understood it to be Jewish law. I've understood it to be what I might call embodied Jewish practice, that it's not enough to have Jewish ideas and values in your head. You actually have to manifest them in the world. So for me, an example that I use a lot is recycling. Like, it's not enough to just believe that it's good for the world if people took care of the earth more, and we could point you to all these Jewish texts and we can say prayers on Shabbat about the earth or whatever. It's like, but if you don't actually physically take that recycling out every single time, then you're not really embodying Jewish practice. But then you shifted to the kind of embodied Jewish practice that I think fits more obviously in this spirituality series, which is breath work and things of that nature. So can you talk a little bit about, I mean, is it both? And if so, what's the nature of the relationship between the embodied Jewish practice as the kind of spiritual practice and then the embodied Jewish practice in terms of living the rest of your life?
I love that you brought in halakha and different ways we might understand that. Like, I thought it'd be like half an hour before we got into that. We're starting right there. So this is amazing. So when we think about halakha, like, as you said, we tend to think of that as referring to a specific sort of quote unquote traditional Jewish legal framework. But if we think about the root of halakha, it is holech, to walk or to go. We think about Abraham, lech lecha, which is to go forth, which is the injunction that we see God gave to Abraham right at the very beginning of Judaism, right? Like, that was the first kind of Jewish act, to move, to go forth. And so what are we doing? What are we developing? We're developing additional halakhas. I would love to see, and I think we're already seeing this, and maybe there's just a little codification of things. I think we're already seeing like multiple halakhas out in the world, but we only recognize one of them as with like a capital H, so to speak, right? And then we tend to fall into this trap of thinking the rest of them are like inferior and whatever. So like, let's go over that, right? And just say like, yeah, there's actually so many ways to be Jewish, and one is not less legitimate than another. You know, that being said, if you follow a traditionally halakhic observant lifestyle where you are keeping kosher, you are praying 3 times a day, Maybe you're wearing a kippah and tzitzit, right? You're tying tefillin. You have no shortage of ways in which you are embodying your Jewish practice every day. And I think there's so much in Jewish tradition. Just think about kashrut, for example. There's so much that we talk about what we should or should not put into our bodies. And we don't have as much of what do we do with our bodies. And so I think that's also another aspect from which we're approaching the work. Like you said, recycling is a great example. Like you can study about recycling all you want, but if you're not literally doing the act of recycling, you are not doing the thing. You're doing something around it. So if we think about this like new or different halakha of being Jewish in the world, then most of the time we're moving through the world, we are improvising. We are responding to the environment we're in, the people that are around, we're responding to what's happening in the moment. We're improvising. If we take that as a metaphor for, or if we use playing music as a metaphor, right? So the improvisation is playing jazz or jamming with your friends or whatnot. What enables you to improvise with high skill and competency and creative expression? Practice. You practice scales, you practice chords, you practice, the specifics in isolation. So I practice a C major chord. Right? I get that under my fingers. I get that into my body so that I don't have to be thinking about it as much. It's just there. My body knows how to do it. And then I level it up. I integrate it into a larger system of a specific melody that's in C major, right? And I know those notes, they're just in a different order, right? I practice those. I get those under my fingers. Then when I'm in an improvisation, I notice the moment and then intuitively I play something in C major that responds to that moment and makes beautiful music. So I think that's also what we're doing when we're sort of in practice sessions. We're isolating things so that we can really integrate them into our bodies, increasing our skill, our understanding, our knowledge and capacity. And then when we go into the broader, complex world, if your body knows how to do it, your brain will follow. And so that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to give our bodies the experience of knowing how to do what we're doing so that we know what it feels like and looks like.
I want to say something that you've helped me process, which is, so we're talking about body so far in a unit about spirituality. And I think that's not surprising to any of the three of us and probably not surprising to most of our listeners. But I do think that without us necessarily noticing it, there's been a massive transformation in how people even understand the word spiritual. I just went to Google and I searched antonyms spiritual. The antonyms I got: physical, material, corporeal. Corporeal is a body word. The idea that this answer from Google gives is spiritual is the opposite of things that are bodily. Now, I'm not saying that because I think you're wrong. I'm saying it because I think you're deeply right. And I think Google is wrong. And I think it's not just Google. I think it's us as a collective society. We have deeply over not just like 100 years, over a few thousand years, we've internalized sort of the Greco-Roman duality notion of body on the one hand and soul on the other. And soul is generally understood as some kind of elevated realm that isn't body, as opposed to something that includes body. And by the way, Jewishly, we do this too. I think we try to pretend that that's just like a thing external to Judaism and we're better than that. No, we have a moment in the morning service where you say one prayer about body, Asher Yatzar, and then we have a second prayer that is all about soul. They're not one integrated prayer. Now, you could argue, well, they're next to each other. And maybe we're supposed to integrate notions of body and soul because they're juxtaposed right next to each other. Basically, I'd love to hear more from you about how maybe there's an implicit critique here, like you're pushing back on those who think that spiritual means not dwelling in our bodies, not connecting through embodied practice.
Even if we think about body and spirit or soul as separate, I personally have not figured out a way to access what we think of as a spiritual experience, not through the body. When I think about some of my deepest spiritual experiences, they may be singing with people in community. They may be out in nature, impossibly gorgeous landscape, or there's some just like subtle beauty that helps just bring me into a place where I feel like I can more deeply connect to what we think of as spiritual connection. The way that I access spiritual connection is through my body. And sometimes that may be stillness in the body, so that other things sort of distractions can drop away. Sometimes it's through movement. I'm feeling the way that energy is flowing. And is that electrons? Is that just the changing of heat, right? That I'm feeling that as it builds up or dissipates in the body? I don't know. I just know what the experience feels like. And it's something that's enjoyable and helps lead me to particular places that feel nourishing and meaningful and fulfilling. So on some level, there's a like, how much does this matter aspect to it? I don't know how to not bring my body with me everywhere I go. So, but to dig a little bit deeper, I think absolutely there are ways in which, on the one hand, Judaism, like we are part of the society that we, exist in. Of course, we are impacted and influenced by that. And then we have specific Jewish ideas and conceptions that are maybe often counter-cultural or counter-societal. What do we mean when we think of soul through a Jewish lens? So there's 3 different words that are commonly translated as soul. There's neshama, there's ruach, and there's nefesh. So neshama, I think of as like this divine breath that sort of animates consciousness or the experience that we have in our bodies. So that's neshama. Ruach, I think of spirit energy, sort of like a catalyst. That's the one that's sort of most like, I don't know, the image I get in my mind is like flame, that kind of an energy. And then we have nefesh. And when I think of nefesh as being this aspect of our soul in which our physical bodies and whatever that non-corporeal metaphysical part of ourselves is, that is all encompassed as nefesh. So let's imagine that there is some version of our soul, our spirit, ourselves that exists before we come into this material physical existence and exists after. Then there's still the question of, well, what's the point existing in or with this body in this world, in this lifetime as we currently know it? And so that's where I think of the body as a sukkah for the soul. Meaning, what is a sukkah? Sukkah in Jewish tradition is this temporary dwelling place that we build to experience the world, experience this physical world for 8 days, purposely thinning the boundaries between the outside world and the inside relative to the homes that most of us normally live in. We have this like different experience. We're supposed to live kind of as much of our lives in the sukkah as possible during those 8 days, basically, right? We eat, we're invited to eat, to sleep, to, host people, to pray, to sing, to make love, like all of these different things happen. And the blessing we say for that is lashev b'sukkah, to dwell in the sukkah. Lex, I've listened to enough of these to know that you love wordplay.
Heck yeah.
So shev is dwell, sheva, 7, Shabbat, 7th day, but like day of rest. So we talk about 7 dimensions of the Jewish space-time continuum. And so we've got, in the physical plane, we have north, south, east, and west, up and down. So those are 6 dimensions, 6 sides of a cube, 6 sort of sides or dimensions of a sukkah. We say the blessing for the sukkah when we are dwelling in it. Like that's what activates the sukkah. Up until that point, it's empty. We bring a 7th dimension of dwelling, of Shabbat, of presence into the sukkah, and that's the mitzvah of the holiday. Same thing, by the way, with the lulav. It's just through this object that, again, we're shaking in front, behind, either side, above and below, and bringing it to center every time. We are the center point of that. So I think of the body, the sacred center, that sort of dwelling place of the soul. And then our soul is experiencing this world, this plane, through the body as the intermediary. Whatever our soul is, however our soul experiences the world, at least in this plane, it experiences it through the body. And so sometimes I sort of think like, I don't know, how can I give my soul the best experience I can while it's here?
It's remarkable that so far we've only gotten through, half of the mission statement of the Mitsui Collective. But actually, I wanted to get to the second part, which is about somatic anti-racism. Initially, my question was just, can you tell us what somatic anti-racism means and how it connects to embodied Jewish practice? But I also want to pick up on what you just said about the Sukkah for the soul, which I think is a really fascinating concept. And I'm wondering if we think of our body as a temporary dwelling place for our soul, then how does race fit into that?
So somatic anti-racism, let's unpack that. So somatic and embodied are often used interchangeably, and they are very similar. And then there's some subtle differences. So somatic is referring to the soma. The soma is a Greek word. I think of the soma as the sort of overlapping layers of self. So when we think about self, what is that? There's many dimensions. We can think about our physical bodies as being ourselves, right? Like I look and feel my physical body, that's me. And I can think of this sort of, I have this like emotional sense of self. I have an intellectual sense of self, a spiritual sense of self. So I think of the soma as really holding all of those things together as this sort of like holistic overlapping sense of self. By the way, I think nefesh is the closest from a Jewish Hebrew language framework to that idea of soma. It's the nefesh as like the body and the spirit. So when we are talking about somatic learning in general, we're talking an experience, we're talking about things that are tapping into all of those layers of self as opposed to just some. And it tends to be most associated with the physical embodied, because honestly, we tend to leave that out the most often. We try to jump straight to the intellectual, straight to the emotion, et cetera. And I think we live in a society that tries to separate the body from everything else that's happening. And I don't think we actually can. And I think also the more we try to do that, it's detrimental. Just think about something that we may think of as a primarily intellectual activity, Jewish text study, analyzing, thinking about it, et cetera. And when do we get most excited, intrigued, compelled, activated, et cetera, by a text? We usually have those reactions in our body. The more we can pay attention to what we're noticing and feeling in the body, that actually can really animate and enliven the text study, because I'm like, oh, I'm reading this text and feeling something in my body that feels an awful lot like anger, for example. What's that about? Or, wow, this text, I'm reading this and this is like physically making me feel like I'm being pulled towards something. What's that about? Anyway, that's when we're thinking about somatic, we're just opening up more of that possibility of thinking about what is the holistic whole body learning that we are cultivating and facilitating from the educator side of things. Okay, so somatic anti-racism. So then we're thinking about what is the somatic approach to how we think about our identities, and specifically in this case, racialized identity, and how does it form across all of those sort of overlapping layers of self, right? So what's my intellectual sense of self, my physical sense of self, et cetera. And I say racialized because that's to emphasize that this is actually not an innate identity for us. This is an identity that has been constructed, right? Like our identities have become racialized. So I think about myself through that lens of a racialized identity, and others view me and I view others through a lens of racialized identity. And we see that or perceive that first and foremost through the body, through the physicality, the physical characteristics and features that people have. Like that's not the only dimension of racialized identity, but it's the sort of topmost or most literally surface level. We can't or shouldn't ignore how that plays out in space. And then we add in this ideology of racialization, which is to then say, and because people fit these constructed categories of racialization, then my body assumes certain things about them, which are not based in any objective truth about that person. They're based on the concept or construct of that person's race and what we are then taught to assume about that because of that. In order to deconstruct that, we have to create greater awareness around what is actually happening in our bodies. And then from there, with more awareness, we move it from the subconscious to a more conscious level, and then we can do something about it. But if we're not even aware it's happening, it still is impacting our behaviors, our actions, right? The way we move through the world, it's still impacting that, but we're not doing that from a place of choice. We're doing that from a place of subconscious reaction. So when we do bring it to higher awareness, then we create some openings to be able to have more choice and act more in accordance with our values, right? To embody our values more fully and close that gap between the ideals that we have, which may be, I don't treat people differently because of race. and recognizing like, oh no, of course I do, because we were born and raised in a society in which that's what we're taught. So of course I do. Let me understand how and why, and then I can narrow the gap between ideal and actuality.
So then what's the relationship between the embodied Jewish practice and the somatic anti-racism in terms of Mitui Collective? In other words, is the somatic anti-racism a subset of embodied Jewish practice, and it's just one that you're emphasizing because of the times in which we live? Or is it because Mitui Collective is mostly centered on the experience of non-white Jews? Or how would you put the relationship between the two? Why is an organization devoted to both of those things?
So it's a yes and. The yes is, when we're looking at doing workshops, right? Like people bring us in to do workshops, both online and thankfully increasingly in person. So when people bring us in, one of the first questions is like, okay, what kind of program are we doing? Are we primarily leading some form of embodied learning, an embodied practice workshop, a movement minion is something that we'll sometimes do, stuff like that? Or are we doing something that is more specifically focused on the content and skill set of somatic anti-racism? There's theory that we look at with somatic anti-racism workshops where we do go deeper into that. But of course, we're integrating somatic learning or embodied practice into those workshops so that we can not just stay in the realm of theory, but that we can also experience what we're talking about and practice what we're talking about. I said earlier that if our body knows how to do something, that the brain will follow. And so when we're thinking about what does it look like to embody anti-racism or to embody liberation in a sort of a broader lens, let's go back to one of our origin stories as a Jewish people. We were slaves in the land of Egypt. We became free. We went through a liberation process, and we did not know how to be free, right? We spent 40 years wandering around the desert, figuring it out. And in that case, there was a whole generation where it was, listen, there's plenty of intergenerational trauma in the Jewish community. And I guess it goes right back to that start. But right, like the idea that a full generation was so stuck in I'm inclined to say mindset, except I really mean body set of enslavement. We needed a generation that was born into freedom or into greater freedom. That's where, when we're talking about liberatory practice, anti-racism, counter-oppression, et cetera, it's one thing to understand what the problems are, right? If we don't understand what the problems are, we can't, approach them with solution. It's one thing to understand the theory around what the alternative is. What is this better world, freer, more just, more liberated world? And we also need to practice embodying that world. We need to practice the skill sets that will lead us to the promised land, so to speak. It's one thing to know that, okay, the Jewish community is more diverse than maybe we thought or used to think, right? This is technically what our communities should look like, but et cetera, et cetera. It's another thing to experience that. We need to experience being in multiracial community. And then not only experience that, to know what does it mean to build authentic relationship with people of all different backgrounds, to move at the speed of trust, right? To put relationship before task. We can experience those things in isolation, like practicing a skill, where then in our work, we'll use simple tools, balls, sticks, simple games, prompts, what we call embodied chavruta learning, where we specifically are learning in relation to other people, because that really shapes the learning. And we'll experience like, okay, I met this person a minute ago, and we're doing this sort of silly thing of tossing a ball back and forth. But through how we're doing that, and then how, as the facilitator, we're guiding that process, giving different prompts for how to go about it, how to think, invitations to think about things in certain ways, reflection questions, like all of those things, right? Then we're experiencing, and what I'm actually doing is I'm having an experience of building trust and rapport with this person who I just met. I'm teaching my body how to do that. And if I know what that feels like, then I can do it with greater skill and capacity when there are more variables going on at once. It's what I also sometimes say is it's like when you are walking a path for the first time, going to a destination for the first time, even when you have the directions to how to get there, it always feels longer than even the way back. And certainly the next time you go, and then the next time and the next time. And then you just, at some point, your body knows oh, there's that restaurant right there, and I turn here and blah, blah, blah. Like it feels shorter, right? And so that's part of what we're doing. We're actually literally laying the neural pathways so that we know how to get to where we're going, so that when we're in the macro sense trying to go there, we've already done it.
So I have a few overused aphorisms in my head that I want to bring into this conversation. One is the silly, like extremely silly aphorism that I don't think is true. Those who can't do, teach. The other, and I'm going to weave these together, I promise I'm not just compounding random overused phrases for the heck of it, is think globally, act locally, which I actually also kind of disagree with in today's world, but I disagree with it less. But the reason I'm bringing those both up is because I'm actually really interested in Mitsui Collective as an organization actualizing, activating the work that you teach others about in workshops in a specific, I'm not going to say micro community, but in Cleveland. Cleveland's not that micro, but in one place. It makes sense to me that an organization like yours that is all about embodying would not just be doing the workshops. And I mean, and I don't mean to dismiss those. Like, it's really important to do workshops with the organizations that you do, both national scale and in different communities that you visit. But there is something special about, we're going to go really deep in one particular local place. Yeah. Honestly, you know, in my dream world, Judaism Unbound would have something like that, where we're currently fully digital. And I love living in this digital land of ours. But I mean, there's the same danger as like academia has, right? Where you're like in the ivory tower or whatever, where you become convinced that you know how to do stuff to the point that you can teach others, and then you don't do the thing yourself. I'm curious if that's part of the seed behind how you've modeled Mitsui Collective with, I think the language you used on their website is like vertical work, deep work in Cleveland, and horizontal, like breadth, BREADTH, across the country and maybe world. But talk to us more about how you've modeled this organization, because I think that there's some teachings there about what others might do.
Sure. So a few things. One, there were pieces of this that were planned or part of the seeds from the start, and then pieces of this that were not planned at all and have emerged. So the first thing that's helpful for context is we launched, well, we started our Instagram account in 2018. So depending how you define the start of something, that's one
That's
start.
official. Once it was Facebook relationships made people official, but now it's Insta account.
Right. I mean, that was sort of the part of like, okay, this is this thing that I have decided enough that I want to exist in the world. I'm going to at least start an Instagram account and start generating some content ideas, like, put it out in the world. So that's one starting point. The sort of more formal organization starting point was that, we got our first seed funding in late 2019, and then I jumped in full time to launch Mitsui Collective as an organization in February of 2020. You may remember what happened in March of 2020. Yeah, great timing. So that obviously changed everything. But originally, I was not planning to launch a new national organization. I was planning to do something that was almost entirely local, really focus on that community building. We were going to, start to pilot and prototype and do pop-ups and all that stuff to get going. And then we would do a small handful of things in other location or with maybe some sort of national spread. But really, it was primarily meant to be local. And then the pandemic happened. Of course, everything moved online, and we became de facto a national / non-geographically specific organization. And then it turns out we gained all sorts of great momentum doing that. And then so we sort of accidentally became an organization that has this sort of like national ecosystem of work. And so we were doing sort of a handful of things here and there, but we kind of slowed down the local aspect. Now we're sort of in that process of rebuilding, sort of putting more resourcing and energy into regrowing that local work and kind of going back into more of a hybrid of what we are now and what that original conception was. So what do we envision that looking like? So you're absolutely right. Like, we lead a great workshop, right? Like, I wouldn't want to sell that short. And I was working in the Jaffe world, Jewish outdoor food farming and environmental education. What I had been noticing before going back to grad school was that we were having these experiences that were fantastic learning experiences, whether that be for 2 hours on a farm, an overnight week, a Shabbaton, right, a weekend retreat, for 5 days up at, a Jewish retreat center or in the mountains, et cetera. And these were happening in isolation, literally outside of or away from the communities where people were coming from. And so the question to me was always, well, what happens when they go back? If these are ideas, concepts, values that we are wanting to help ingrain for folks, whether that be sustainability, love of nature, Jewish community, etc., it's a both and. Yes, give the deep dive immersive experiences that can really inspire and catalyze, but also people have to be able to do it in a way that is integrated into the heart of their communities, into their day-to-day life. So how does that tie into our model as an organization and how we're wanting to grow is, that we will be limited as an organization if it's only these like one-off isolated things. Just to keep going back to this metaphor, because it's useful and also something that a lot of people understand. It's again, playing music. One, it's totally different to go to a concert than to play music. Still a great experience, but let's just name those are different things, right? So we're not performance oriented, right? We are around cultivating experiences where people are in the experience. But you could go like to a weekend retreat that's like, come play music for a weekend. And you might have, if it's well run, you'd have a great time. Maybe you're making music by the end of it. But then if you go home and you never practice, can you call yourself a musician? Right? So that's true for us too. It's saying what does it mean to be a practitioner? One of the learnings that's really stuck with me, I learned this from Reverend Angel Kyoto Williams Sensei, who is either the first or maybe second ever Black woman to be ordained as a Zen sensei. I had the opportunity to learn with her. And one of the things that she put out into the community was thinking about this question of what makes this sticky, what makes your sort of commitment to doing the work. She said, is what you call your practice, is that a practice or is it a hobby? And like everyone in the room was just like, oh, like, uh-huh. Right. So like, is this a hobby that you just do every so often because it's fun and enjoyable, which is fine, but like, don't call that a practice that you're really committed to. If you're really committed to a practice, you're doing it with some level of consistency, regularity, focus, discipline. That looks like having some form of in-person opportunity for people to come together in a community of practice so that they can be supported in the learning and the growth and the practicing of the skills that we're trying to embody more fully. Right. And be building community along the way. Something that I'm excited for us to, that we are planning to also be growing into is, what does that look like online? Even for our local community, I think having this, okay, sure, maybe they're coming to our practice sessions, maybe multiple times a week. And they're also able to plug into this online thing that supports that as well. And connecting this like larger, more national or even global community. Like, I think that'd be pretty cool. And something else that I also wanted to add, just to give, I think, a little bit more depth in terms of why community of practice. When I think about Jewish community, Jewish practice, like models that we see in the world right now, the ones that I think are really growing and thriving are the ones that make it matter that you are with other people. And I think, by the way, this is why we've seen so much growth in sort of the boutique movement and wellness spaces, where it really matters who's there and you feel like it matters that you're there and you're doing it in a way where you're building community, you're actually interacting with other people, versus just going to a gym and like running on the treadmill next to a bunch of people, which that works for some people. Great. That's never really worked for me. To me, if we have Jewish communities where you're doing the equivalent of just going to shul, let's say, and like the prayer equivalent of running on a treadmill that just happens to be in the same room as other people, to me, that's kind of missing the point.
To pick up on that, I mean, there's a story on your website. It's actually awesome. I feel like we should have a story like this on our website that's long and goes through this whole how this thing came about. But it really begins more or less with you doing CrossFit, which is a kind of organization like you're talking about, that a gym.
Every Jewish organization starts with a cross, right, Dan?
Sure,
right, right.
And also, we've talked about CrossFit with Casper Richard Kyle in great episodes, and just really talking about like that as a form of quasi-religious experience or maybe post-religious experience, to think about how might we imagine new ways of living our lives in ways that borrow from religion, among which are the importance of doing it with other people. And what does that look like? And CrossFit is often raised as an example of what that might look like. And as I was reading the story on your website, I was thinking to myself, so is that kind of the origin story of Mitsui? But then it kind of went off in a different direction. And part of that is because of COVID, like you were talking about. But I guess what I was really curious about, if you could talk about a little bit, is putting aside everything that Mitsui is currently doing and all of that. And we're just talking to Yoshi. Maybe it's almost a version of going back 3 or 4 years. Knowing what you know now in terms of having developed some of the ideas more deeply, what would this look like locally? What would the day-to-day look like? Like, I know what CrossFit is like. I know what a yoga studio is like. What would be happening in a Mitsui gym, whatever we want to call it, on a regular basis? And would it be more like a yoga studio in the sense that there are all kinds of, maybe a CrossFit gym also, that there are all kinds of times of day when you can come and there's all kinds of different programs going on and you do have your crew there and they know if you're missing? And or in your dream world, is it kind of like a community that meets at a certain time and does a certain set of things together? And what would those be? I mean, I'm really interested in your imaginations of what it would look like on the ground, because I feel like in this series, we're talking to a lot of different people about spirituality. And it tends to be one of two things, not necessarily in the series, but in general, that people say either they have a big picture philosophical practice that gets manifested in certain types of activity, but isn't really manifesting as a new form of Jewish living, right? In terms of institutions, in terms of communities. And if one asks people, so is what you are imagining, could it be an alternative to synagogues and to the ways that we usually imagine that Judaism tends to be practiced? They often are like, oh, no, not an alternative. I wouldn't want to say that there's anything wrong with the synagogue. And I kind of want to get at, well, okay, let's put that aside, that anybody who wants to go to synagogue can. But for those of us who don't want to, what would be a compelling alternative? Could we imagine such a thing? Because if we can't imagine it, then we're never going to bring it about.
Yeah, I love this question. Okay, so the answer goes back to just that question of how are we embodying our values, right? And I think that and again, if you follow a traditional, observant, halakhic lifestyle, et cetera, like, again, you have no shortage of ways in which you are practicing your Judaism, right? Manifesting it through your actions all day, every day, or like a lot, again, praying 3 times a day, everything you eat, you have no shortage of ways to do that. Those of us who don't follow in that particular, line of practice, it can be really easy for our values, our quote unquote Jewish values, to live in this sort of like ethereal headspace, right? And there's just that, I've said this now several times, like what's that gap between how we're actually acting in accordance with those values, et cetera. But the other aspect of that is what enables us to manifest those in specifically Jewish ways. A lot of the values that we hold in Jewish community, treating your neighbor well, doing good acts in the world, et cetera. Some of those have specifically Jewish language, some of those don't. But like when they're just in that ethereal headspace, they're not actually that different from like most ethical traditions in the world. And I think that a lot of the sort of non-Orthodox liberal progressive world, I think that's an issue. I think when we're asking this question, why be Jewish? It's like, oh, Judaism has such great values. And yeah, we do. But like, why should I care about why they're like a specific Jewish framework for them, as opposed to I'm just trying to be a good human? And what does this look like in terms of the practice and the experience? Sometimes I think about this as like, what does Judaism look like the other 6 days of the week? Meaning we're really good at Shabbat. Any Jewish spiritual leader, educator, facilitator, et cetera, worth their salt can probably create a really great Shabbat experience, relatively speaking, like many can. There are lots of people who can lead a great Shabbat experience, whether that's like the whole 25 hours of Shabbat or it's just Friday night, whatever, right? And what does it look like the other 6 days of the week? If it's not through traditional prayer 3 times a day, if it's not through keeping kosher, if it's not through, et cetera. Part of our work is answering that question. So what I think that looks like for us in person is to have, one is just to very specifically say, it's probably more likely, what it is not probably is the whole community always coming together all at once. It is more likely to be we have a whole range of options that allow people to come both at times, one, just come at times that work for them, because of course that's part of the challenge. We've got busy lives and just different schedules, et cetera. So to just have an accessibility of options in that sense, and to also have different types of classes. And I think part of what we're developing in terms of our pedagogy and methodology is what is the core ideas, conceptual frameworks, and principles that are part of all of the work we do, even if they manifest in different ways. And then what are the different kind of spokes that emerge from that one kind of central wheel, right? So we might have folks who really want to focus on the breath work. We might have folks who really want to do sort of our like meditative movement. We might have folks that are really actually like don't want to do a lot of movement work, right? They're like, I want the somatic anti-racism and I want to like be supported as I navigate that. So that's what we're really playing with. And then also, how can we solve some just like general challenges of modern life? How do you do what you need to do for your kids and also take care of your own needs, right? So I think that's something where if we're really dreaming down the line, I'd love for us to have some sort of, experiential embodied Jewish after school program where kids are coming and they're playing in the nature space we have, and they're tumbling around and we're just doing all that, just great learning. And then parents can come and they come, do a movement session with us. And then all the families gather together for dinner together, right? And then everyone goes home and puts their kids to bed. It's sort of like the idea of stacking functions. We're solving multiple needs at once in the same space, and then also just bringing people together, as opposed to the sort of separating and siloing that we see, I think, really often throughout the Jewish world and the world beyond.
I was sitting here and I asked myself, what are the most common embodied practices that Jews already do? Because I'm being honest with myself and with the two of you and with our listeners. Like, I'd love to think that people listen to our episodes and then immediately, like, boom, go and do a bunch of things with their bodies, with their hearts, with their heads. Some of them won't, unfortunately, like change the day-to-day rhythms of their life. And if I'd be a hypocrite if I said like, oh yeah, when I listen to other podcasts, I totally change everything about me. So part of what I think is helpful is, what am I already doing that's embodied, but like kind of without awareness or without consciousness? I think the most common embodied practice in Jewish life today is please rise. Please be seated. I think that is the most common. And it's not, by the way, that's in synagogues, but it's not even just in prayer context. Like, there's a lot of different context. It could be, I mean, I don't love this, but like rise for the Pledge of Allegiance. Like, right. But like, that is an act of embodiment. I don't think when people stand at a prayer service, they're going, wow, we're standing as a community to collectively, with our bodies, send a message that this prayer is important. Mm-hmm. And by the way, I don't want to be ableist. Like, I'm aware that not everybody rises in body, but that's the theory behind it, right? Like, there is a reason that certain prayers people rise, and that's meant to sort of underline them. There's all sorts of prayer choreography. The first word of most prayers is Baruch, and it's usually translated blessed or blessed, if you want to be Shakespearean about it. Baruch is an embodied word. It is built on the word berech, which means knee. I would translate it like knee bent. So Baruch atah Adonai, there's a way in which it's kind of like knee bent I am to you, God. It's equating praised or blessed with a physical activity, which is bending your knee, making yourself a little lower to God. Now, I don't know that I would have chosen that ritual action if it were up to me. It's the one we happen to have. But there's all these little hints of embodiment that we do. People go on tiptoes 3 times to say holy, 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 kadosh, kadosh, kadosh. By the way, I go up on my tiptoes once and then I go in a circle because I don't think God is just above me. So I feel like I need to make it different than just pointing upwards. But like, there's all these embodied actions that we already do and I think are mostly done without thought. And it's not that everything's about thought. We can have practices that aren't heady. But I am curious if you have some ideas for how we would take those Baruch moments of knee bent, that moment of please rise. Even the Amidah. Amidah means standing. That's this central Jewish prayer that some people say multiple times a day. And even if you don't, it's centrally located in the service. It's called, stand. And I'm curious how we might bring more consciousness to those actions, or maybe just do different things in our bodies to make those things stickier or more meaningful.
Absolutely. There are so many of those, let's call them micro embodiment moments that are just, woven throughout. And I feel like I have experienced this, and I think a lot of people I know have experienced those moments of choreography. There's something that is compelling about that to a lot of people. And I think there's ways where it's like, you may understand and be able to recite very little of a Hebrew prayer service, but you know all those moments when, I bow here, I go on my tiptoes here, I gather the light for the Shabbat candles, right, before I do the blessing, etc. There's something about that where, maybe it is going through the motions in a very literal sense, but that's not in a way to mean that's not meaningful. Sometimes that's the most meaningful, especially if you don't know what the Hebrew even is that you're saying, right? So I think there's clearly something about that is compelling for people. And I think for us, it's saying, okay, let's think about how we bring those from isolated micro moments. And I think that's part of our work, is to maybe bring a little more systematization, where they're not these kind of random things, but they're part of a more cohesive, coherent framework. And I think there's some deconstructing that I like to do, where we think, why is it that we do X movement, X embodied ritual, X thing, right? What is behind it, or what could be behind it? I think the other thing that comes to me when I think about, is it proscriptive or is it descriptive? Baruch being connected to berech, the bending of the knee, right? Proscriptive meaning some designer, quote unquote, was like, this is the ritual and we're designing it because of XYZ. Descriptive is describing something that was already happening. Bending the knee in supplication, there's nothing inherently or exclusively Jewish about that. To me, it certainly makes sense that it was like, well, that's how people were embodying that modality of supplication. And so let's weave it into the language and the prayer. Right. So one, I think to me, there's a lot of things where if we look at things descriptively in Jewish liturgy and text, as opposed to prescriptively, certain things make a lot more sense, or we could, it just reads differently in that way. And I also think the other thing about that is that it shows that we have always been in dialogue with other traditions, cultures, communities, et cetera, surrounding us. It didn't come out of nowhere. It came out in dialogue. And I think there's so much of that throughout what we think of as Jewish ritual and tradition and culture and Jewish foods and all of that. So I think that that's something that we can and should, one, recognize that's always happened. And number two, continue to happen, right? I think we're strengthened when we explore this work in dialogue with other traditions. So that's part of when we explore, what are other embodiment traditions, whether that be yoga, Tai Chi, or Qigong, dance styles, movement, et cetera, to be in dialogue with those things. But then also, this is where we need to be careful not to appropriate those things, to sort of say, what do we learn about where we are coming from when we see things that come from other traditions? And in some cases, listen, I'm Chinese. So when I'm looking at something like Tai Chi, that is part of my heritage, right? So it's not an other, it's just multiple lines of lineage. But for me, it's saying, I'm not going to say I'm just going to do Jewish Tai Chi. I'm going to say, what do we learn? What do we see mirrored in Tai Chi? Why are Tai Chi movements done in a particular way? What are they tapping into? How do we deconstruct that and then reconstruct it in a way that is rooted in more Jewishly specific ideas and concepts and theologies and whatnot? And it may have certain things that look pretty similar, but it's come through sort of a whole different process that puts it into a practice and a system.
I have another question that basically boils down to how much we love your website and your mission and vision statement. Dan talked about the story on your website, but I'm really drawn towards a sentence in your mission and vision that just says, Mitsui Collective is open to all spiritual seekers while centering our work and community building around those historically placed at the margins of Jewish life. So specifically, those who haven't been centered in Jewish life, that's who you really want to be drawing in and empowering. And the first group that you name, you mentioned a number of different groups that have not been centered, but the first group you name is Jews of color and non-Ashkenazi normative Jews. So I'd love to hear, as we arc towards the close, a little bit about that. I mean, we talked about somatic anti-racism, but it's not just about anti-racism. It's also about celebrating Jews of color as people. So I'd love to hear a little bit about what that looks like.
So one is, I think, that we as Jews of color tend to have a broader range of, cultural lineage that we are bringing in. And I think it's really important that we have the ability and the invitation to honor all of those things in ways that often in Jewish space, we have to we feel like we're forced to leave at the door. Number two is that when we're thinking about what are we creating the opportunities to practice towards a more liberated world, when we're in spaces that are by and for Jews of color, we are, yes, reducing the sort of amount of background or sometimes foregrounded racism that exists in the space. So yes, we're doing that. And there's like an easing of that. And we're also practicing what it looks and feels like to be in a more liberated space where we're able to bring ourselves more fully into that space. And an opportunity to work on then the sort of like more nuanced aspects of work that need to happen that are that are more complex and nuanced, that we have the opportunity to work on in those spaces that might sort of not get as much attention because we're just dealing with the like larger, generalized racism in broad space. And then, I mean, there's so many other things. There's also just, how do we unpack all of the different aspects of identity? How do we think about the specific lines of intergenerational trauma and how that specifically impacts Jews of color differently than Jews who are exclusively, white, European, Ashkenazi, et cetera, which it's not that there isn't that. There's a lot of there's plenty of intergenerational trauma to go around. And what are the specific vectors? And how is that different for Jews of color to really have that vector of racism as well as anti-Semitism, as well as et cetera, right? And how do we create the spaces and then the modalities for working with that and navigating and healing, hopefully, from that. And then also, again, just when we're thinking about how do we understand the ways that we are impacted in Jewish community because of the bodies we're in, right? We're talking about embodiment work, right? It's also just like, what are those embodied dynamics and how do we navigate those and create better culture?
So this is Editor Lex popping in with the question. When we were recording, right as we closed, we closed there, but Yoshi was like, I have a story. It's not exactly related to questions that you've asked, but I want to share this because it, I think, will be exciting to listeners. So Yoshi did that, and I'll just say now, in an act of fantasy, as if I asked this question, Yoshi, do you have any closing stories that you want to leave our listeners with today?
Yeah, I have one that I think is fun and also interesting and maybe important. Because I know you've had at least several episodes where you and your guests have talked about magic in Jewish space.
Yeah.
And so I mentioned before, we use some simple tools in a lot of our workshops and practice sessions of, tennis balls and sticks and different things. So specifically with the sticks, like we have a 1 foot stick that we'll use for different things, but sometimes we will bring out the 6 foot long sticks. And this is a staff, right? And there is something really interesting that happens when you hand someone a 6 foot long wooden stick. People are like, oh, right. It's a substantial thing to hold. And there's all these different traditions too in martial arts and somatic spaces of using like a bow staff and different movements and forms and things you can play with. So that's some of just why we even did it. But then it was like, okay, well, what are we doing here? And how do we connect Jewishly with this? And it's like, okay, where do we see a staff come up in Jewish tradition? Oh, Moses, hi, right? Like, and not only, this wasn't just a walking stick, this was a magical object. That right there suggests to me like, let's keep exploring how we're using this object. Thinking about how pop culture, right, also influences things, right? Also thinking something I feel like you two will appreciate. So in the recent series, The Rings of Power, which is based on, Tolkien's works in the Lord of the Rings universe, there is this magical character in the Rings of Power. And there's this scene where he's sort of defending these halfling proto-hobbit type folks from these wolves. And he sends out this energy blast through his hands into the ground and it kind of blasts away these wolves. And it's a cool moment. But more interesting then is after we see that his hands are all damaged from that act of magic. And he's going about this like healing process. And in the lore of The Lord of the Rings, there's sort of this suggestion around like, oh, maybe it'd be a good idea for you to have an object that channels the energy through the object rather than through your hands, because clearly channeling the magic, it's a lot, right? It can be damaging to your physical body. So maybe you need something like, oh, I don't know, a wizard's staff, right? It's like, seems like very clearly foreshadowing that. But seeing that then just gave me this inspiration and just sort of like insight into maybe this is part of how we use, this is why we see these different objects show up in magical things, whether that be like magic wands or magic staffs or what have you. And then specifically for our work, how might we use this not just as a tool for movement, but as actually something that is helping us to channel something differently than the way we connect just through our bodies without any other sort of physical tools. And there's so much else. I mean, we have lots of ritual objects in Jewish tradition. This is maybe just like a more one we can like actively engage and play with in a different way, as opposed to objects where we're usually more like placing upon ourselves or wrapping ourselves in. This is something that's we're actually like actively doing something with. But yeah, we're early on, but we also like to pun and talk about, what's our staff development work. We actually literally have a wooden branding iron with the Mitsui Collective logo that we like burn our brand into on our sticks. And so, that's part of our branding strategy. Anyway.
I love it. Too many puns for Lex.
Too many puns.
Never too many. No, I was about to say, so first off, I've got a little wizard staff that lives near my computer for when I lead services online, but I've got a little yad. I think there's a way in which yads, which we use to read from the Torah, they're kind of magic wands in the same way of like we need some kind of barrier between us and the magic or us and the sacredness, because if we were to touch the Torah ourselves, or like somehow there'd be this overpowering thing. So we have the yad as a barrier, magic wand is similar. Anyway, I could go on and on. I'm looking forward to your sea parting workshop. But anyway, thank you so much, Yoshi Silverstein, for joining us. This has been a fantastic conversation.
Thank you. Such a pleasure to be here, and really appreciate the work that you're all doing.
And thanks so much to all of you out there for listening. We hope you've enjoyed this conversation, and we hope that you enjoyed this conclusion to it. A little different than normal to get just a fun story, but I think it was pretty magical, pretty awesome, pretty on our brand. Thank you, Yoshi, for bringing it. We are going to close this episode out by reminding you what we mentioned at the top, Yoshi Silverstein's course in the Anya Shiva. It starts super soon at the beginning of October. You can register for it at judaismunbound.com/classes. I figure you just heard him give some amazing, amazing wisdom on the podcast. You probably want to experience that in real time over the course of a whole semester. And if you do, you can register at judaismunbound.com/classes. Just click Yoshi Silverstein's class. And also, if the price for any reason is not accessible to you, you can access financial aid information from the same page. So thanks so much for listening. And with that, this has been Judaism Unbound.